I'm standing in a probate courtroom watching my sister-in-law's face drain of color as the judge hits play on a security camera video. On the screen, Stephanie is leaning over my dying aunt, pointing at documents, raising her voice while Aunt Margaret, frail, medicated, and clearly exhausted, shakes her head no. Over and over. No. Until finally, after 4 hours of pressure, Margaret's hand trembles as she signs away her $750,000 estate. The estate she'd promised me for 30 years. The property Stephanie had moved into within days of Margaret's death. And the judge's expression? Pure disgust. But let me back up and tell you how I got here. Hey everyone, welcome back. If this is your first time here, I share real stories of family betrayal and the satisfying revenge that followed. If you've ever watched someone swoop in to exploit a vulnerable loved one while you were actually doing the caregiving, this story will resonate. If you find this valuable, I'd appreciate your support, a like, a comment, or joining this community for more stories like this. Share your own experience in the comments below. I read every single one and your stories matter. Now, let's get into it. My name is Nicole Anderson, but most people call me Cole. I'm 42 years old, a commercial real estate agent earning about $88,000 a year in Seattle, Washington. I'm married to Brian for 16 years now, and we have twin sons, Tyler and Connor, both 13. We live in Ballard in one of those older craftsman homes that needs constant work but has character. This story is about my Aunt Margaret. Well, technically she was my great-aunt, my grandmother's younger sister. But to me, she was everything. Margaret never married, never had children. She poured all that maternal energy into me from the time I was born. Weekly dinners, holiday traditions, girl trips to Vancouver and San Francisco. She taught me about investing, showed me how to negotiate, encouraged my career when my own parents thought I should settle down. Margaret was sharp, wickedly intelligent. She'd worked as a financial analyst for 30 years and made brilliant investment decisions. By the time she retired at 68, she'd accumulated serious wealth, about $750,000 in assets, including a stunning waterfront property on Mercer Island worth $625,000. The kind of house with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Washington, a dock, and gardens she tended herself until her health declined. She told me dozens of times over the years, usually during our Wednesday dinners at her favorite Italian place, "Everything goes to you when I'm gone, Cole. You've been my family when blood relatives couldn't be bothered." She even showed me her will once, about 3 years ago, pointing to my name as sole beneficiary. "No surprises," she'd said. "You've earned this by actually loving me, not my money." Now, my husband Brian, he's a good man. Patient, kind, works as an electrical engineer. But his sister Stephanie? That's where this story gets dark. Stephanie Riley is 38, 4 years younger than Brian. She's a pharmaceutical sales rep making around $125,000 annually, drives a leased BMW, lives in one of those modern townhomes in Capitol Hill with all glass and no warmth. She's attractive in that calculated way, perfect highlights, designer clothes, teeth so white they're almost blue. But there's something hollow behind her eyes. Brian and I had noticed a pattern over the years. Stephanie had this talent for identifying vulnerable elderly relatives and, well, positioning herself advantagingly. Years earlier, she'd pressured their own grandmother into changing investment accounts, giving Stephanie power of attorney. By the time their grandmother passed, most of her savings had mysteriously dwindled. Brian suspected Stephanie had been borrowing funds, but we could never prove it. The family chalked it up to grandmother's poor financial decisions in her final years. Growing up, Brian told me Stephanie had always been entitled. When they were kids, she'd throw tantrums until she got what she wanted. As an adult, she'd perfected manipulation, tears, guilt trips, playing victim. She cycled through friendships quickly because people eventually saw through her act. Margaret barely knew Stephanie. They'd met maybe 4 times over the years at family gatherings. Stephanie showed zero interest in Margaret until she learned about the estate. 2 years ago, Margaret called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was showing a property downtown when my phone kept buzzing. I finally answered between viewings. "Cole," she said, her voice steady but serious. "I need you to come over." The doctor called with results. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Terminal. Maybe 18 months, they said. I drove straight to her house. Found her sitting in her sunroom, hands folded in her lap, staring at the lake. "I've had a good life," she said when I sat beside her. "I'm not afraid. But I need to make sure things are handled properly. You're going to be my healthcare proxy. My executor. Everything." Over the following months, I became her caregiver. Not because of the inheritance. I genuinely didn't think about it. Because I loved her. I rearranged my work schedule, cutting back to part-time. We did chemo together, me holding the basin when she got sick. Radiation appointments every Tuesday and Thursday, me in the waiting room with work emails and cold coffee. When her mobility declined, I helped her shower. When her appetite vanished, I made her favorite soup every Sunday even though she could only manage a few bites. Brian was incredibly supportive, taking over more with the boys while I spent evenings at Margaret's. The twins understood too. They'd visit their great Aunt Mags on weekends, playing board games even when she was too tired to focus. Then, about a year into Margaret's diagnosis, Stephanie appeared. I was at Margaret's one evening, setting up her new pill organizer, when the doorbell rang. Stephanie stood there with flowers and a bright smile. "Nicole, I heard about Aunt Margaret. I wanted to come by and help." I was genuinely touched. "Steph, that's so sweet. Come in." She visited a few times over the next weeks. Brought meals. Chatted with Margaret about nothing important. Margaret was polite but confused. After one visit, she asked me, "Is she Brian's sister?" "I don't really remember her." "Yeah," I said. "But it's nice she's making an effort now, right?" Margaret just patted my hand. "I suppose." Last summer, Margaret's condition deteriorated rapidly. She was on hospice care at home, wanting to die in her own bed with a view of the lake she loved. The pain became severe. They increased her morphine significantly. She started sleeping most of the day, lucid only in brief windows. During one particularly brutal week, Margaret had a pain crisis. I took emergency leave from work and basically moved in, sleeping on her couch, managing medications around the clock, coordinating with hospice nurses. I was exhausted, running on coffee and fear, knowing we were approaching the end. On Thursday of that week, Stephanie texted me. "Hey, Cole. You've been there nonstop. Let me stay tonight. You need to go home, see your family, get real sleep. I've got this." I hesitated. But Brian had been solo parenting for 5 days. The boys needed me. And Stephanie had been surprisingly helpful lately. "Are you sure?" I texted back. "Positive. I'll call if anything changes." "Go." So I went home that night, hugged my sons, took an actual shower, fell asleep in my own bed for the first time in a week. The next morning, Friday, my phone rang at 8:47 a.m. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. "Ms. Anderson? This is Charles Hampton, Margaret Chen's estate attorney." My stomach dropped. Did Margaret? No, she's still with us. But I need to inform you that Margaret signed new estate documents yesterday. The entire estate now goes to Stephanie Riley. She came to the hospital yesterday afternoon with the papers. The world tilted. What? I was surprised myself. The new will was properly witnessed and notarized. But given Margaret's condition, I felt you should know immediately. She seemed quite confused during the signing. I don't remember hanging up. Don't remember driving to Margaret's house. I just remember standing in her bedroom doorway, watching hospice adjust her while she drifted in and out of consciousness, and thinking, "What did you do, Stephanie?" When Margaret was briefly awake, I leaned close. "Aunt Mags? The will. You changed the will." Her eyes fluttered open, clouded with medication. "Will?" she whispered. "I don't. I'm so tired, Cole." "Did Stephanie bring you papers to sign yesterday?" Confusion crossed her face. "Papers? Maybe," she said. "I don't remember. Everything's fuzzy." My hands trembled. I called Brian. He was stunned. "Stephanie was there overnight? Are you sure?" Charles just called. "Margaret signed over everything. The house, investments, all of it. To your sister." Silence. Then, That manipulative, I'll call her right now. But Stephanie called me first. Around lunchtime, her number flashed on my screen. I answered with shaking hands. Nicole. Her voice was bright, cheerful. How's Margaret today? What did you do? Excuse me. The will, Stephanie. You had her sign over the estate. A pause. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted harder, calculating. Margaret made her own decision. She realized who actually cared about her financial security. You were just the nurse. I helped her understand the bigger picture. She's dying. She's on morphine. She doesn't know what day it is. She knew exactly what she was signing. And, honestly, Nicole, maybe you should examine your own motives. You've been awfully invested in Margaret's assets. I protected her from exploitation. I couldn't even respond. Just sat there, phone pressed to my ear, as she continued. The attorney witnessed everything. It's legally binding. Margaret wanted this. Maybe accept that and let her die in peace. She hung up. 3 days later, Margaret passed away. I was holding her hand. She'd been unconscious for most of the final day, breathing slowing gradually. At 3:22 a.m., she took her last breath with me and a hospice nurse present. Peaceful. Quiet. The lake outside her window reflecting moonlight. I called Brian, crying. Called the boys. Made the necessary calls to family and the funeral home. And then, sitting in Margaret's kitchen as sunrise painted the water gold, I got a text from Stephanie. Spoke with the estate attorney. I'll be taking possession of the property within the week. Need you to remove any personal items. Thanks for caring for Aunt Margaret. Within the week. Margaret wasn't even in the ground yet. The funeral was held 5 days later at a small chapel overlooking Puget Sound. About 40 people attended, Margaret's former colleagues, neighbors, friends from her book club. I delivered the eulogy, barely holding it together as I talked about our Wednesday dinners, her terrible jokes, her kindness. Stephanie attended wearing black Chanel and oversized sunglasses. She sat in the back, left immediately after, didn't speak to anyone. Later that evening, the family gathered at Brian's parents' house. Stephanie arrived late, making an entrance. When Brian's mother asked about Margaret's estate, Stephanie actually smiled. Margaret left everything to me. She trusted me with her legacy. Brian's jaw clenched. You manipulated a dying woman. I provided clarity. Unlike some people who were clearly scheming. She looked directly at me. Margaret saw through that eventually. Brian's father intervened before it escalated. But later, Stephanie posted in the family group chat a text that included Brian's parents, his brother, aunts, uncles. I read it with growing rage. Aunt Margaret knew who deserved her legacy. Some people pretend to care while scheming for inheritance. She recognized genuine love versus opportunism. I'll honor her wishes. The implication was clear. I was the opportunist. I'd spent 2 years caring for Margaret, loving her, and now I was being painted as the villain by someone who'd barely known her. I cried that night. Not just about the money, though $750,000 would have changed our lives, but about the injustice. About Stephanie rewriting history. About Margaret's true wishes being stolen. Then, 3 days after the funeral, something happened that changed everything. I was sorting through condolence cards at my kitchen table when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Mrs. Chin, Margaret's next-door neighbor. She was in her 70s, retired teacher who'd lived on Mercer Island for decades. She held a manila envelope. Nicole, she said quietly. I have something you need to see. I wasn't sure if I should get involved, but after that young woman moved a truck into Margaret's driveway yesterday and started taking furniture, I couldn't stay silent. My heart pounded. What is it? I have security cameras. They monitor my property for package theft, but they also capture Margaret's front door and parts of her living room through the windows. I reviewed the footage from the night that woman stayed over. The night Margaret supposedly changed her will. She handed me the envelope. Inside was a USB drive. Watch it, Mrs. Chen said. Then decide what to do. Margaret was a dear friend. What I saw on that video made me sick. That evening, after Brian put the boys to bed, we sat at my laptop and plugged in the drive. The footage was timestamped from the Thursday night Stephanie had volunteered to stay with Margaret. The video began at 8:47 p.m. Stephanie's BMW pulling into the driveway. The timestamp rolled forward. At 9:15 p.m., lights were visible in Margaret's living room. We could see through the large front windows two figures, one clearly Margaret in her chair, the other Stephanie. At 9:43 p.m., Stephanie was pacing. Through the windows, we could see her gesturing, holding papers. Margaret's body language was defensive, shaking her head, hands up. At 10:22 p.m., Stephanie leaned close to Margaret, pointing at the documents, then at the door. The body language was aggressive, threatening. We couldn't hear audio, but we didn't need to. Margaret was visibly distressed, looking toward the bedroom, clearly wanting to lie down. At 11:08 p.m., Stephanie was still talking, animated, holding up her phone showing something. Margaret's head was drooping. She was exhausted. At 12:34 a.m., the notary arrived, identifiable by the official document case. Stephanie ushered the person inside. Through the windows, we watched Margaret sign papers, but her movements were slow, confused. Stephanie's hand was on Margaret's shoulder, then guiding her hand on the signature line. The notary left at 12:51 a.m. The lights went off at 1:15 a.m. For hours, Stephanie had pressured a dying, medicated woman for 4 hours in the middle of the night until she broke her down. Brian and I sat in silence after the video ended. Then he said what I was thinking: we need a lawyer. A really good one. The next morning, I started making calls. I needed an estate litigation attorney who specialized in elder abuse and undue influence. After several consultations, I met with David Kim at a downtown firm. He had 15 years of experience in probate disputes and a reputation for winning seemingly impossible cases. I showed him the security footage. His expression darkened as he watched. This is textbook elder abuse and undue influence. The coercion is visible. The timing, middle of the night when she's vulnerable. The extended pressure. The obvious distress. Can we fight this? Absolutely. But I'll be honest, it won't be cheap. My retainer is $25,000 for a case like this. And we're fighting against a properly executed will with witnesses and notarization. $25,000. That was a huge chunk of our savings. But this wasn't about money anymore. This was about justice for Margaret. Do it, I said. Whatever it takes. David moved fast. Within 48 hours, he'd filed emergency motions in probate court to freeze Margaret's estate, preventing Stephanie from accessing or transferring any assets. The motion alleged elder abuse, undue influence, fraud, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. We also filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services. Even though Margaret had passed, they investigated claims of elder abuse for pattern establishment and criminal referral. David's strategy was multi-layered. We needed to prove 3 things. Margaret lacked mental capacity during the signing due to medication, Stephanie used undue influence and coercion, and Margaret's true wishes were reflected in the previous will. First, David subpoenaed Margaret's complete medical records from the final months. The hospice charts were damning. The Thursday night Stephanie stayed, Margaret was on a significantly increased morphine dosage due to the pain crisis. The nursing notes documented confusion, disorientation, and impaired decision-making. One note from that very day read, "Patient unable to follow complex instructions. Memory impairment noted. Recommend family avoid important decisions during this phase." Next, we secured testimony from Margaret's oncologist, Dr. Sarah Martinez. She provided an affidavit stating, given Margaret Chen's medication regimen on the date in question, particularly the elevated morphine doses, she would have been significantly cognitively impaired. Her capacity for complex decision-making, especially regarding legal and financial matters, would have been severely compromised. She would have been highly susceptible to manipulation and unable to fully understand the consequences of signing legal documents. We also obtained Margaret's previous will from 6 months prior, the one where I was sole beneficiary. David had Charles Hampton, the estate attorney, provide testimony that Margaret had been clear, adamant, and fully competent when creating that will. She specifically stated multiple times that Nicole Anderson was to receive everything, Charles testified. She spoke at length about their close relationship and Nicole's devoted care. She was emotional but completely lucid. Nothing suggested she was uncertain or would change her mind. Then came the security footage. David had it digitally enhanced and time-stamped by a forensic video expert who certified its authenticity. We compiled a detailed timeline showing 4 hours of visible pressure and coercion. But David wanted more. We need testimony from people who witnessed their relationship, who can speak to Margaret's true wishes and Stephanie's opportunism. I reached out to Margaret's friends, her book club, her former colleagues. One by one, they agreed to provide statements. Janet, who'd known Margaret for 30 years, wrote, "Margaret spoke often about Nicole. Called her the daughter I never had. She never mentioned Stephanie. Not once. When Margaret discussed her estate plans, she was always clear that Nicole would inherit everything because Nicole had been family in action, not just blood." Margaret's hospice nurse, Caroline, provided particularly powerful testimony. "In my professional opinion, Margaret Chin was confused and disoriented during her final weeks. The medication levels required for pain management made informed consent impossible for legal documents. I noted in my charts multiple times that families should not make important decisions during this period. Had I known someone was pressuring her to sign estate documents, I would have intervened immediately." We also filed complaints with the Washington State Ombuds for Elder Care Abuse, the State Attorney General's Office, and local law enforcement. David believed criminal charges could follow the civil case. Meanwhile, Stephanie was moving forward as if nothing was wrong. She'd hired her own attorney and filed motions to dismiss our case. She gave a deposition where she claimed Margaret had invited her to discuss estate planning, that Margaret was completely lucid and grateful for my help, and that I was a jealous relative trying to steal what Margaret rightfully left me. Her attorney argued the video was taken from too far away to prove anything, that the notary had verified Margaret's competence, and that the hospice notes were irrelevant because people can have brief periods of clarity. But David had one more card to play. He tracked down the notary who'd witnessed the signing, a woman named Patricia who did mobile notary work. Under subpoena, she gave a deposition. David asked her directly, "Did Margaret Chin appear fully aware of what she was signing?" Patricia hesitated. Then, clearly uncomfortable, she seemed tired. Very tired. The other woman, Stephanie, did most of the talking. Honestly, I was concerned. But my job is just to verify identity and witness signatures, not determine capacity. If I'm being completely honest, something felt off. But I didn't think it was my place to refuse. That testimony was gold. Even the notary had concerns. 5 weeks after filing, we had our hearing date. David spent days preparing me for potential testimony. We reviewed every document, every timeline, every piece of evidence. The night before court, I barely slept. The morning of the hearing, I dressed in a navy suit Margaret had helped me pick out years earlier for a big client presentation. Brian held my hand in the car. "Margaret would be proud," he said. "You're fighting for her. That's what matters." The King County Probate Court was intimidating: dark wood, high ceilings, the judge's bench elevated above everything. Stephanie sat across the aisle with her attorney, wearing a cream-colored suit and a practiced expression of calm confidence. But I had something she didn't: the truth, documentation, and a video that would expose exactly what she'd done. Judge Ellen Morrison presided. She was in her late 50s, known for being thorough and no-nonsense in probate disputes. David had done research. She had a reputation for protecting vulnerable adults and had previously ruled harshly against elder abuse. The hearing began with opening statements. Stephanie's attorney, Robert Fletcher, argued that Margaret had made a clear, witness decision to leave her estate to someone who showed financial acumen and would honor her legacy appropriately. He painted me as an overly involved caregiver with questionable motives who couldn't accept Margaret's final wishes. Then David stood. He laid out our case methodically. The medical records proving cognitive impairment. The hospice notes documenting Margaret's confusion. The testimony from friends and caregivers about Margaret's true relationship with me versus Stephanie. The previous will showing consistent intent over years. "Your Honor," David said, "this isn't a case of a changed mind. This is textbook elder abuse. Exploitation of a dying woman by someone who barely knew her, who waited until she was most vulnerable, who applied pressure in the middle of the night when she was heavily medicated and exhausted. Then he played the video. The courtroom went silent as the footage rolled on a large screen. We watched Stephanie arrive. Watched her pace and gesture for hours. Watched Margaret's obvious distress, her attempts to go to bed, her defensive body language. Watched Stephanie lean in, point at the door in what looked like a threat. Watched the breakdown of a frail, dying woman under relentless pressure until, finally, she signed. For hours condensed into 12 minutes of the most damning footage I'd ever seen. When it ended, Judge Morrison's expression was granite. She looked at Stephanie with barely concealed disgust. "Ms. Riley, I'd like to hear your explanation for what we just witnessed." Stephanie's composure cracked. Her attorney tried to object, but the judge cut him off. "This is my courtroom. Ms. Riley, you're the beneficiary in question. Explain what I just saw." Stephanie stood, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. "Your Honor, I was simply..." Margaret wanted to discuss her plans. "She asked me to stay. We talked about her wishes. She was grateful for my financial guidance." "For 4 hours? In the middle of the night?" "While she was clearly trying to rest. She had concerns about the previous will. She wanted to make changes." "Did she tell you that? Or did you suggest it?" Silence. "Ms. Riley, did Margaret Chin initiate this conversation about changing her will, or did you?" Stephanie's face flushed. We discussed various options. I may have suggested that. You may have suggested. While she was dying. While she was on heavy pain medication. While she was under your sole supervision after volunteering to give her caregiver a break." Judge Morrison's voice was ice. "Continue." But Stephanie had nothing. She stumbled through non-answers while her attorney looked increasingly uncomfortable. Then David called his witnesses. Dr. Martinez testified about the medication effects. Caroline, the hospice nurse, described Margaret's impaired state. Charles Hampton read from his notes about Margaret's clear, repeated statements that everything should go to me. Janet from the book club cried as she described Margaret calling me her daughter. Finally, David introduced Margaret's journal, something I'd found while cleaning her house. Entries dated from throughout the previous year. "Cole came again today. She's so patient with my confusion. I don't deserve her love, but I'm grateful for it. Made arrangements with Charles. Everything to Nicole. She's earned it by simply being family. Stephanie visited. Strange. Barely remember her. She asked a lot of questions about my investments. Felt uncomfortable." That last entry was from 2 months before Margaret's death. The hearing lasted 6 hours. By the end, Stephanie's attorney was barely making arguments. The evidence was overwhelming. Judge Morrison didn't need time to deliberate. She ruled from the bench. "I've reviewed the evidence presented today, and I find it compelling and deeply disturbing. The security footage clearly shows extended coercion of a vulnerable, dying woman. The medical records unquestionably demonstrate significant cognitive impairment at the time of signing. The testimony from medical professionals, caregivers, and friends establishes Margaret Chen's consistent, long-term intent to leave her estate to Nicole Anderson." She turned to Stephanie. "Ms. Riley, what you did was reprehensible. You exploited a dying woman's vulnerability for personal gain. You manipulated someone in their final days when they deserved peace and dignity." Stephanie's face had gone white. "I hereby void the will dated from that Thursday evening as the product of undue influence, elder abuse, and exploitation. Margaret Chen's previous will, naming Nicole Anderson as sole beneficiary, is reinstated and will be executed as written. The estate is unfrozen and will pass to Ms. Anderson as originally intended." Relief flooded through me. Brian squeezed my hand. But the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, Ms. Riley is ordered to pay all legal fees incurred by Ms. Anderson in this matter, totaling $25,000. She is prohibited from receiving anything from Margaret Chen's estate or making any claims against it now or in the future. Then Judge Morrison did something unexpected. She looked at the court reporter. I'm also ordering that full transcripts of this hearing, including the video evidence, be forwarded to the Washington State Attorney General's office and the King County Prosecutor for potential criminal investigation into elder abuse and fraud. Stephanie gasped audibly. Ms. Riley, you should retain criminal defense counsel. This behavior is not only civilly actionable, it may constitute criminal elder abuse under Washington law. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel struck. Stephanie's attorney grabbed her arm as she stood shakily. I watched her leave the courtroom, her perfect composure shattered, her designer heels clicking rapidly on the tile floor. David turned to me with a slight smile. That went better than expected. Brian hugged me tight. Margaret would be proud. The legal process took another 2 months to finalize, but the outcome was certain. Margaret's estate passed to me exactly as she'd intended. The Mercer Island property. The investment accounts. The savings. All of it. But more importantly, justice had been served. Within 3 days of the hearing, the Washington State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into Stephanie's conduct. 2 weeks after that, the King County Prosecutor filed criminal charges, elder abuse, fraud, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Stephanie's employer learned about the case through court records. They monitor legal issues for employees who work with elderly clients and healthcare providers. She was immediately suspended pending their internal investigation. A week later, she was terminated. Her job required ethical conduct and trust with vulnerable populations. The company couldn't risk the liability. The criminal case moved slowly, but the evidence was solid. Stephanie's attorney eventually negotiated a plea deal to avoid trial. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of elder abuse and 1 count of fraud. Sentencing included 2 years probation, 200 hours community service, restitution of $25,000 to me for legal fees, and a permanent mark on her criminal record. She'd never work in pharmaceutical sales again. The BMW got repossessed within months. She had to move from her Capitol Hill townhome to a small apartment in Renton. Her social media, which had once shown a carefully curated life of luxury, went silent. Brian's family was horrified. His parents apologized to me repeatedly, ashamed their daughter had done something so vile. His brother cut off contact with Stephanie entirely. Holiday gatherings became awkward. She wasn't invited to any. As for me, I honored Margaret's wishes. I sold the Mercer Island property for $625,000. With the additional assets, I had about $750,000 total, exactly what Margaret had built through years of careful investing. Brian and I paid off our mortgage, put aside college funds for Tyler and Connor. I went back to full-time work with the security of knowing my family was financially stable. But the most meaningful thing? I established the Margaret Chin Cancer Research Scholarship at the University of Washington. $50,000 to fund research into pancreatic cancer treatment, renewable annually. Margaret's name would help save lives. Her legacy would be knowledge, hope, and progress, not the greed of someone who'd tried to steal from her. It's been 4 months now since the court hearing. Sometimes I drive by Margaret's old property. The new owners have kept her gardens beautiful. I think about our Wednesday dinners, our trips, her terrible jokes and sharp wisdom. She left me more than money. She left me the example of living with integrity. And in the end, that integrity won. Stephanie tried to steal Margaret's legacy, but all she got was justice, the kind delivered by judges, prosecutors, and a security camera that captured every moment of her cruelty. So that's my story. Sometimes the best revenge is protecting those who can't protect themselves and letting consequences catch up to predators. If this story resonated with you, I'd be grateful for your support, whether that's a like, a comment, or joining this community for more stories. Drop a comment below. Have you ever dealt with family members who exploited elderly relatives? I'd love to hear your experiences. And if you're dealing with something similar right now, document everything and get legal help immediately. Security cameras, medical records, witness statements, gather it all. You're not powerless. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video where I share the story of a woman whose brother stole her late husband's life insurance payout. Take care.